The world had ended at 3 o'clock, or at least, the world inside the crooked canyon that sheltered the town of Redemption Gulch. The sound had come first, a deep, gut-wrenching groan from the earth itself, followed by a deafening roar that sent a shockwave of dust and grit blasting down the main street. The Croft Consolidated Mine, the town's black heart and sole reason for being, had swallowed a lungful of its own men. Now, an hour later, the air was a choking slurry of coal dust and screams. The town's alarm bell, a frantic, clanging heartbeat, hammered on relentlessly from the church steeple. Outside Dr. Elara Vance's small clinic, the grim harvest had begun. The porch and the dusty patch of earth before it had become a field hospital, a tableau of hell painted in shades of red and black. Men lay on splintered planks, doors pulled from their hinges, anything that could serve as a stretcher. Their bodies were broken in ways that defied the natural order, limbs twisted at impossible angles, faces caked in a dark paste of blood and soot. In the center of this maelstrom stood Ellie. At 32, she had the lean, weathered look of someone who had fought the frontier and achieved, at best, a hard-won stalemate. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight, functional bun, with loose strands now clinging to the sweat and grime on her face. Her apron, once white, was a ghastly canvas of her afternoon's work, but it was her eyes that held the chaos at bay. They were a cool, clear gray, and they moved with a terrifying calm, assessing, cataloging, and deciding who might live and who was already gone. "Pressure on that leg. Now," she barked, not looking up from the man whose arm she was setting with a sharp, brutal crack of bone. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound of pure agony. "Daniel, you hold him," she ordered a broad-shouldered miner. "He faints. You let him. He moves, and this bone will tear right through his skin." She moved with an almost inhuman economy of motion, her hands sure and steady as she bound the splint. No wasted steps, no hesitation. She was a physician, but here, in this raw moment, she was a battlefield general, and the enemy was death itself. She moved to the next man, then the next. Her quiet, direct commands slicing through the panicked whimpers of the wounded and the keening grief of their families. She was performing the cold, necessary calculus of triage, prioritizing the survivable, comforting the dying, and ignoring the dead. It was then that two foremen, their faces masks of panic, shouldered their way through the crowd. They carried a well-dressed young man between them, his expensive tweed jacket torn, and his face pale with shock. "Make way! It's Julian Croft!" one of them yelled, his voice cracking with fear and misplaced authority. "He's hurt bad! The doctor needs to see him now!" The name fell over the suffering crowd like a physical weight. Silas Croft. The vulture. The man who owned the mine, the town, the general store, and the souls of every person in it. And this was his son, the heir apparent. Ellie finished tying a bandage around a miner's head and turned, her gray eyes sweeping over the newcomer. Julian Croft, barely 20, was conscious, his leg bent at a sickening angle below the knee where white bone peeked through the shredded fabric of his trousers. He was grimacing in pain, but his eyes were filled with an arrogant indignation, as if the mountain had personally offended him by daring to collapse on his watch. At the exact same moment, another group approached from the other side. 4 grim-faced miners carried a makeshift stretcher bearing the body of a man named Thomas Gable. He was young, no older than Julian, but his face was slack, his skin a deathly blue. A jagged, splintered piece of support timber, thick as a man's wrist, was embedded deep in his chest. A gurgling, pink-tinged froth bubbled at his lips with each shallow, desperate breath. His wife, Sarah, trailed behind them, clutching the hand of their 5-year-old daughter, her face a silent scream of horror. Ellie was already moving toward them before they even stopped. Her fingers went to Thomas's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter. His chest wasn't moving. A tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed, and his chest cavity was filling with blood and air, crushing his heart. He had minutes, perhaps less. "He needs you, Doc, now," one of Julian's men insisted, stepping into her path. "Mr. Croft's orders! You help Julian first!" Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine had been replaced by Croft's gold years ago, scurried over. "Listen to him, Doc," he said, his voice a low, pleading whisper. "You know the rules. It's the boy." Ellie completely ignored them. Her focus was absolute. She looked from Thomas's dying face to Julian's shattered leg. Julian's injury was severe, a compound fracture that would require immediate and careful surgery to prevent infection and save the limb. It was dangerous, but he was stable. He was breathing. Thomas was not. The choice was not a choice at all. Not to her. "Put him down here," she commanded the miners carrying Thomas, pointing to a relatively clear space on the porch. "Gently." "What in God's name are you doing?" Julian's foreman demanded. "Did you not hear me? That's Croft's son." Ellie finally turned to look at him, her gaze so cold and sharp it seemed to physically push him back a step. "I heard you," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "He has a broken leg. This man has a hole in his chest. Now get out of my light." She turned back to her patient and knelt, pulling a small, polished mahogany box from her larger medical bag. It seemed out of place in the filth and chaos, an artifact from another world. She unlatched the silver clasps and opened it. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, lay a set of surgical instruments. They were not the crude iron tools of a frontier sawbones. They were gleaming German steel, a gift from her mentor back in Boston. Fine scalpels, hemostats, probes, and aseptic silk thread, their edges honed to a razor's sharpness. It was the only kit of its kind for 500 miles, a treasure she had guarded for years, knowing its worth in a land where a small cut could kill a man. Julian, seeing the kit, pushed himself up on his elbows. "That's for me," he rasped, his voice tight with pain and entitlement. "Father paid for that. You use it on me." Ellie didn't even glance at him. She knew what this meant. To save Thomas, she would have to perform a thoracotomy right here, on the porch. She would have to cut through muscle and between ribs to relieve the pressure on his heart and remove the timber. The procedure would be brutal, and the jagged wood would almost certainly chip, bend, or utterly ruin the delicate instruments. The blades would be sacrificed. Sheriff Brody grabbed her arm. "Ellie, for the love of God, think about what you're doing." She looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up to his face. She didn't say a word. The look in her eyes was enough. He released her as if her skin had burned him. She turned to Sarah Gable, who was sobbing uncontrollably. "Hold his hand," Ellie said softly, her tone shifting from command to comfort for the first time that day. "Talk to him. Let him hear your voice." Then, with the unwavering certainty of a priestess performing a sacred rite, she selected a scalpel. Its polished surface reflected the chaos around her for a fleeting second. The dust, the blood, the terrified faces of her town. Then she lowered the blade to Thomas Gable's chest and made her first, precise cut. The choice was made. And in the silence that followed the slice of steel through skin, the fate of everyone in Redemption Gulch was sealed. Night fell on Redemption Gulch not as a comfort, but as a shroud. The hours of frantic work had bled into a long, grim twilight of counting the dead and tending to the living. Inside her clinic, the air was thick with the scent of carbolic acid, blood, and human sweat. By the flickering lamplight, Ellie moved like a ghost among the cots, changing dressings, administering laudanum, and murmuring quiet words of reassurance. Thomas Gable, the man for whom she had risked everything, was breathing steadily in the corner, his wife asleep in a chair beside him, her hand still clutching his. The surgery had been a brutal success. The clinic door creaked open, and Sheriff Brody stepped inside, holding his hat in his hands as if he were entering a church. His face, illuminated by the lantern glow, was pale and drawn. He didn't have to say a word. "Julian Croft?" Ellie asked, her voice flat with exhaustion. Brody nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Just now, an embolism," they said. "From the leg. The rough setting of the bone." He swallowed hard. "Ellie, his father's on his way." He chartered a special engine from Three Forks the moment he got the wire. A deep, primal fear, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel all day, pricked at the edges of her resolve. She had known this was a possibility, a probability even, but the finality of it landed like a stone in her gut. She simply nodded, picked up a bloody sponge, and dropped it into a basin, the sound echoing in the tense silence. An hour later, a sound unlike any other in the canyon sliced through the night. It wasn't the chuffing rhythm of the daily ore train. It was a long, piercing shriek of a whistle, sharp and imperious. It was the sound of a predator announcing its arrival. Through the clinic window, Ellie saw the single, brilliant cyclops eye of a locomotive as it thundered down the track, pulling just one carriage. It was not a passenger car, but an opulent private vessel of polished black steel and gleaming brass, a stark violation of the town's grimy aesthetic. The train hissed to a stop. A moment later, a man stepped down onto the platform, framed by the light from the carriage. Silas Croft was in his 60s, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the very light around it. There was not a speck of dust on his polished boots, not a hair out of place in his perfectly coiffed silver mane. He radiated a chilling, silent intensity, his stillness more menacing than any outlaw's swagger. He did not look at the wounded, or the grieving families, or the damage to his own mind. His cold, dark eyes scanned the street until they found her clinic, and then he began to walk. His enforcers, a dozen hard-faced men in matching dusters, fanned out behind him, their leader a tall, unnervingly calm man with a captain's bearing and eyes like chips of ice. They moved with the disciplined efficiency of a wolf pack. Ellie met Silas Croft in the doorway of her clinic. She would not let him bring his sterile authority into her sanctuary of healing. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her blood-stained apron with unconcealed disdain. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but a low, resonant whisper that carried an absolute, unquestionable power. "Dr. Vance," he began, the title dripping with condescension. "I have come to audit your performance." "There is nothing to audit, Mr. Croft," Ellie replied, her own voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "A medical decision was made?" Croft almost smiled, a horrifyingly empty gesture. "A business decision," he corrected her. "And a poor one. My son, Dr. Vance, was an asset, an investment." "That miner," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the clinic's interior, "is a liability, a piece of depreciating equipment. You chose to save a broken tool over a vital component of the machine's engine." The words were so devoid of humanity, so clinically cruel, that they left Ellie momentarily speechless. He spoke of his own son's death as if it were a failed transaction. There was no grief in his eyes, only the cold fury of a man whose property had been mishandled. "I am a doctor," Ellie said, finding her voice. "I treat patients. I don't manage assets." "And that is your failing," Croft countered smoothly. "You live in my town, in a building I own, on land I purchased. You exist here because I find your presence profitable. Your purpose is to keep my workforce functional. You have forgotten that." He took a step closer, his voice dropping further. "I just spoke with the Gable woman. I offered to purchase her husband's remaining labor contract for a generous sum. Settle the account, so to speak." She declined. He shook his head in mock pity. "Sentimentality. It is a disease, doctor, and it appears you are the source of the outbreak." This was the core of him, she realized. Not evil in the fiery, passionate sense, but a chilling, reptilian coldness. He was a man who saw the entire world, from the mountains he hollowed out to the people who lived under their shadow, as items on a ledger. Her act of saving a life was, in his eyes, an act of defiance, a challenge to the natural order of his world. She stood her ground, her silence a wall against his poisonous logic. His empty smile finally faded, replaced by a look of flat, final authority. "This clinic, this town, it is all mine, doctor. You have forgotten your place," he stated, as if it were a law of physics. He laid out his terms with the precision of a surgeon. "You have 48 hours. Be gone from this valley. Leave everything behind. If you are still here when the sun rises on the third day, my men will remove you. Consider this my final act of charity." He turned to leave, his point made, his verdict delivered. Then he paused and turned back, a final thought occurring to him. He gestured with his chin toward the imposing, silent man at his side, Captain Thorne, and the disciplined men arrayed behind him. "I have business to attend to here in any case," Silas Croft said, his voice laced with a newfound terrifying pleasantness. "Expanding the company's holdings. I brought 30 of my finest surveyors to ensure the property line is clearly marked." Dawn broke on the first day with a cold, gray light that seemed to leach the color from the world. The 48-hour clock was ticking. For Ellie, the initial shock had hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. Silas Croft had mistaken her compassion for weakness. He thought he could excise her from Redemption Gulch like a tumor. But a doctor knows that you cannot save a body by cutting out its heart. She would not run. She would fight. And to fight, she needed an army. Her first stop was the sheriff's office. The building was little more than a clapboard box with a single barred window, but it was supposed to represent the law. She found Sheriff Brody sitting at his desk, staring at a bottle of cheap whiskey he hadn't yet opened. The badge on his chest seemed to weigh him down. "I need you to deputize them, Brody," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. "The miners, the townspeople. Croft's men are a private force on private land. If they threaten the citizens of this town, that's your jurisdiction." Brody let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Jurisdiction? Ellie, My jurisdiction ends where Silas Croft's property line begins, and that line runs down the middle of my spine. He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a miserable, hunted look. He owns this office. He owns the deed to my house. My wife gets her medicine on credit from his company store. You think this badge means a damned thing? It's supposed to, Ellie said, her voice sharp. Supposed tos don't stop bullets, he whispered, gesturing to the window. You see that street? It's his. He'll kill us all to get to you, just to prove he can. You did the right thing, Doc. I'll admire you for it until the day I die. But you did it in the wrong town. Don't ask me to put my family in the ground because of it. He picked up the whiskey bottle, and the cork squeaked as he twisted it free. He locked his eyes on the amber liquid, a man making his final surrender. Go home, Ellie. Or better yet, run. Leaving the sheriff to his bottle, Ellie walked into the oppressive silence of the main street. It was usually bustling at this hour, but today it was a ghost town. Doors were shut. Windows were shuttered. The few people she saw scurried into alleyways or turned their faces away, suddenly fascinated by a loose board on the walkway. The fear was a palpable thing, thick and suffocating like the coal dust that perpetually hung in the air. She went to Henderson's general store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful, mocking jingle. Mr. Temmant. Henderson, a portly man who had always greeted her with a warm smile and a piece of horehound candy, was behind the counter, meticulously polishing a set of scales. He refused to meet her eye. Henderson, I need supplies, she said. Ammunition for a shotgun, and whatever rifle cartridges you have. He stopped polishing, his big hands suddenly still. Can't help you, Doc, he mumbled to the counter. Fresh out. I was in here 2 days ago. You had 3 crates. Sold 'em? He lied, his face flushing with shame. Big order. To whom? He finally looked at her, his expression a miserable mix of apology and terror. Captain Thorne was my first customer this morning. Made it clear that selling ammunition to anyone else would be bad for business. My credit line with the Croft Company. Ellie, I have a wife. 2 daughters. His voice cracked. Please don't ask me to choose. It was the same everywhere she went. O'Malley, the Irish saloon keeper who she'd patched up after a dozen brawls, suddenly wouldn't sell her a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, claiming his entire stock had soured overnight. The blacksmith, a bear of a man whose son's broken arm she had set just last winter, was suddenly too busy to reinforce her clinic door. They were not bad people, but they were trapped, their lives and livelihoods hanging by the single, golden thread of Silas Croft's patronage. Each rejection was another stone in the wall being built around her, isolating her, suffocating her. Croft wasn't just coming for her with guns. He was turning the very town she served into a weapon against her. Her last stop was the small, clapboard shack where Thomas Gable was recovering with his family. It felt like a final, desperate pilgrimage. Sarah Gable opened the door and pulled Ellie inside, her eyes filled with a fierce, tearful gratitude. Thomas was propped up on a set of pillows, pale but breathing easy. We heard what Croft said, Sarah whispered, wringing her hands. It's our fault. We'll go to him, Thomas and I. We'll beg. No, Ellie said, her voice firm as she checked Thomas's bandages. You will do no such thing. Begging is what he wants. It's how he wins. But what can we do? Thomas rasped, his voice weak. We're just miners, Doc. We've got nothing but our hands. He and the half-dozen other miners crowded into the small room, looked at her with a desperate hope that was almost painful to witness. We owe you our lives, but we can't fight as men. They offered to hide her, to smuggle her out of the valley under the cover of darkness. They would risk anything to save her, but they would not stand and fight. They had seen what Croft's enforcers did to men who stood up for themselves. She left their shack with a heavy heart, the reality of her situation settling in. She was utterly alone. As she stood in the middle of the street, the silence pressing in, a voice cut through the air, raspy from disuse and cheap whiskey. Quite the popular lady, ain't ya? She turned. Leaning against the wall of the assayer's office was a man who looked like a relic from a bygone era. He was old, with a grizzled beard stained yellow by tobacco, and his clothes were little more than rags. But it was his eyes that caught her. They were a pale, washed-out blue, cynical and weary, but they were the only eyes in town that weren't looking away. It was Jedediah Jed Stone, the town's resident drunk and prospector, a man who spent more time talking to his mule than to any person. They're scared, Jedediah, she said. Scared's what Croft plants instead of corn, he grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Better harvest. He pushed himself off the wall and ambled closer. He smelled of dirt and sour mash. Heard he gave you till the third sunrise. He did. Jed squinted at her, his gaze analytical. And you ain't running. You're either very brave or very stupid. Haven't decided which. A flicker of something not hope, but a desperate possibility sparked in Ellie's chest. He wasn't on Croft's payroll. He had nothing to lose. Which one do you think would make a better ally? Jed stopped and let out a dry, rattling chuckle. Oh no, not me. My fightin' days are long over. He gestured around at the shuttered windows and empty street. This town's rotten anyway. It ain't worth savin', and I sure as hell ain't dyin' for it. He started to walk away. His words another door slammed in her face. But then he stopped, his back still to her. Just so you know, he said, without turning around. Thorne's got a man on the ridge behind your clinic. A sharpshooter. Best watch your windows. And with that, he shuffled off toward the saloon, leaving Ellie standing alone in the street. It wasn't an offer of help, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a piece of information, a warning. And in a town of cowards, it was the first crack in the wall of silence. The second day dawned with a palpable sense of dread. The town held its breath, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. The sun climbed higher, baking the dust in the street, yet the town remained deathly still. Just before noon they came. Captain Thorne and a dozen of Croft's men rode into Redemption Gulch, not with the chaotic fury of bandits, but with the chilling, synchronized precision of a cavalry unit. Their horses' hooves fell in a steady, rhythmic beat that echoed off the silent storefronts. They were not here to parley. This was a demonstration. Thorne led them past the saloon, past the general store, his cold eyes scanning the shuttered windows, knowing that behind every one, a terrified family was watching. He stopped his horse in front of the livery stable. The owner, a balding man named Miller, had committed no crime other than giving Ellie a brief, sympathetic nod the day before. It was enough. Thorne dismounted, his movements economical and precise. Miller emerged from the stable, wiping his hands on an oily rag, his face a mask of confusion that quickly curdled into terror. Mr. Miller, Thorne said, his voice calm and conversational, carrying easily in the silence. By order of Mr. Silas Croft, your lease on this property has been terminated, effective immediately. Two of Thorne's men dismounted and grabbed the bewildered stable owner, holding him fast. Miller began to stammer, to protest, but his words were lost as the other men began to work. They moved with a brutal efficiency, dragging a buggy, saddles, and bales of hay out into the street. They were not just evicting him, they were erasing him. When the stable was mostly empty, Thorne tossed a lit match into the dry hay scattered across the floor. The flames caught with a hungry whoosh, and thick, black smoke began to billow out into the clean mountain air. From her clinic window, Ellie watched in horror as the structure that represented Miller's entire life's work was consumed. The town watched with her, silent and impotent. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, a message written in fire and ash for all to see. This is what happens to those who even look at my enemy with kindness. Imagine what I will do to her. With the stable burning behind them, a pillar of smoke scarring the blue sky, Thorne and his men turned their horses and rode the short distance to Ellie's clinic. They formed a silent, menacing semicircle in the street before it. Thorne dismounted and walked to the edge of her porch, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He took off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh to knock the dust off. "Dr. Vance," he called out, his voice as devoid of emotion as if he were inquiring about the weather. "Mr. Croft asked me to extend you one final courtesy. He is a man of business, not a man of sentiment, but he is not without a certain appreciation for efficiency. Wasting resources is distasteful to him. He has authorized me to offer you safe passage out of this valley. The offer expires in 10 minutes. After that, you will be considered a resource to be cleared." The front door of the clinic opened. Ellie stepped out onto the porch. She was not holding a white flag. In her hands, she held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles looking like two dark, hollow eyes. She held it steady, its stock resting firmly against her hip. The image was stark and powerful, one woman in a blood-stained apron against a dozen professional gunmen. She looked past Thorne to the burning stable, then back at him, her gray eyes burning with a cold fire. "Tell Mr. Fander Croft," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and defiant, "that my lease isn't with him. I have a lease with the people of this town, whether they remember it or not. I am not leaving. Thorn showed no surprise. He simply sighed, a small puff of air, as if he were disappointed in her lack of pragmatism. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible hand signal. Crack! The shot came from the ridge behind her, just as Jed had warned. The sniper's bullet ripped through the air, splintering the doorframe, a hand's breadth from Ellie's head. She didn't flinch. As splinters rained down on her, she raised the shotgun. Boom! The blast was deafening, a roar of defiance that echoed through the canyon. One of Thorn's men was lifted clean off his horse, his chest erupting in a spray of red as the buckshot hit him. Before the others could react, Ellie dropped behind a set of barrels on her porch as a hail of lead tore through the clinic's facade, shattering windows and chewing through wood. Just as Thorn's men began to advance, 2 more shots rang out, sharp and distinct from the others. Pop! Pop! They came from a dusty alleyway across the street. Another of Croft's men grunted and clutched his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. Thorn's head snapped toward the source of the shots. In the shadows of the alley, a grizzled old prospector tipped his hat, a rusty Colt Peacemaker smoking in his hand. Jedediah Stone had decided his fighting days weren't over after all. The unexpected resistance from a second front, however small, broke the momentum of the assault. Thorn's men were professional, not fanatical. They were paid to intimidate and enforce, not to die in a protracted street battle. Thorn sized up the situation, the fortified doctor, the hidden shooter, the mounting cost of this eviction, and made a calculated decision. He barked an order, and his men fell back, collecting their wounded comrade and leaving the dead one in the dust. Thorn retrieved his horse and swung into the saddle, his cold eyes locking onto Ellie as she peered over the barrels. He had lost the skirmish, but the war was far from over. At dawn, Dr. Vance, he promised, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence. At dawn, we will be back, and we will burn this building to the ground with you in it. The sun began its slow descent, painting the smoke-stained sky in hues of blood, orange, and bruised purple. The body of Croft's man had been dragged away, but the dark stain remained in the street, a grim punctuation mark on the day's violence. Inside the clinic, the air tasted of gunpowder and shattered glass. Ellie methodically pushed a heavy desk against the door, reinforcing the splintered wood, while Jed, the old prospector, coolly ejected the spent cartridges from his Colt Peacemaker. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the tinkle of glass as Ellie swept a corner clean. Finally, Jed spoke, his voice a low rasp. "You're a fair hand with that scattergun, for a doc." "My father taught me," Ellie replied, not looking up. "He said the frontier doesn't care if you're a man, a woman, or a saint. It only cares if you're ready." She paused, then looked at him, her gaze direct. "I didn't expect your help," Jed grunted, pouring a generous measure of whiskey from a flask into a tin cup he'd found. He slid it across the floor to her. "Wasn't planning on it, but there's some things a man can't just sit by and watch." He took a long swallow from his own flask. "Besides, I've seen this play before. Different town, different tyrant. The ending's always the same." "What ending is that?" "The one where the man with the most gold and the most guns wins," Jed said, his voice laced with a deep, ancient bitterness. "I wore a badge once, in a railroad town back in Kansas. Good people, hard-working. Then a baron decided he wanted to run his tracks right through their farms. They stood up to him. I stood with them." He stared into his flask as if seeing a ghost. "The baron brought in 50 men, just like Thorn's. The town fought, for a week. Then the money ran out. The food ran low. The baron offered to buy them all out for 10 cents on the dollar. And one by one, they folded. Shook his hand and took the money, leaving me standing alone in the street. People always fold, Doc. It's in their nature when things get hard." His cynicism was a thick, suffocating blanket. It was the same logic as Croft's, just from the other side of the gun. A world where power was the only truth. "Maybe you're right," Ellie said quietly, taking a sip of the whiskey. It burned. "But I have to believe you're wrong." As if summoned by her words, there was a soft, hesitant knock on the clinic's back door. Jed was on his feet in an instant, his Colt leveled. "Who is it?" Ellie called out, her own shotgun at the ready. It's Thomas Gable, Doc." The voice was weak, but resolute. "And some others." Ellie and Jed exchanged a look of disbelief. She moved the cabinet she'd braced against the back door and opened it a crack. Standing in the twilight was Thomas, leaning heavily on his wife, his face pale with effort but his eyes burning with determination. In his free hand, he held an old hunting rifle. Behind him stood a small, grim-faced crowd of about 8 or 9 men, the very miners who had earlier offered only to help her escape. The blacksmith was there, his massive hands holding a heavy hammer like a war club. The public cruelty of the stable burning, followed by the sight of the doctor and the town drunk making a stand, had done what her pleas could not. It had ignited a spark of shame that had burned away their fear. "We saw the smoke," Thomas said, his voice raspy. "We saw you fight. You didn't give up on me when I was half dead. We ain't giving up on you now. He'll kill you all," Jed warned, his voice gruff as he lowered his pistol. "He'll burn your houses, not just the stable." "Let him try," the blacksmith growled, his voice a low rumble. "We've lived on our knees in this town for too long. It's time we remembered how to stand." They filed into the clinic, a small, desperate army of the forgotten. They were not soldiers. They had 3 old rifles, a couple of pistols, and a collection of shotguns meant for hunting rabbits, not men. But they had something else. One of the miners, a wiry man named Silas, unslung a heavy canvas sack and carefully placed it on Ellie's examination table. He opened it, revealing a dozen wax paper-wrapped sticks of dynamite from the mine, complete with fuses and blasting caps. "We don't have many guns," Silas said with a grim smile, "but we know how to make big rocks into little rocks." The mood in the room shifted. Despair was replaced by a fragile, dangerous hope. For the next several hours, the clinic became a war room. Ellie, with her methodical, analytical mind, took charge. She was no longer just a doctor. She was the commander of a rebellion. She spread out a torn piece of butcher paper and, with a piece of charcoal, began to sketch a map of the main street. "We can't survive a siege in here," she stated, her voice clear and confident. "They'll surround us and burn us out, just as Thorne promised. We have to use the town." Jed, his cynicism momentarily forgotten, stepped forward, his past as a lawman rekindled. He looked at the crude map, his mind seeing angles and fields of fire. "She's right," he said, tapping a spot on the paper. "They'll come straight down the gut, expecting to overwhelm us. We make our first stand here, at the clinic. Draw them in." "Then what?" the blacksmith asked. "Then we make them regret it," Silas, the miner, chimed in. He pointed to the alleyways and adjacent buildings on the map. "We fight a retreat, fall back into the street. We rig charges in the assayer's office and the feed store, not to kill them all at once, just to create chaos, panic, funnel them." They spent the night planning, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight. It was a desperate, improbable strategy forged by a doctor, a drunk, and a handful of miners. They would use their knowledge of the town's every alley and rooftop. They would use the tools of their trade, the miners' dynamite, as weapons of war. Ellie laid out her remaining medical supplies, turning a section of the clinic into a makeshift infirmary, knowing that by morning it would be needed. They were impossibly outnumbered, a handful of citizens against a private army. But as they worked together, sharing whiskey and loading shells, they were no longer just a collection of broken and frightened men. They were an army. And they were ready for the dawn. There is a unique silence that precedes a battle, a stillness where the world seems to hold its breath. It settled over Redemption Gulch, as the first sliver of dawn bled across the eastern ridge. Inside the clinic, no one spoke. The small band of defenders was in position, their faces grim in the gray light, knuckles white on their weapons. Ellie, her shotgun loaded and resting on a barricade of overturned furniture, looked out through a shattered window. The air was cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of impending violence. Then they appeared. They emerged at the far end of the street like a dark tide, 30 men on horseback, spreading out in a disciplined line that spanned the entire road. Captain Thorne was at their center, a still, menacing figure against the rising sun. They were not a rabble. They were an army, and they had come to execute the final, brutal phase of a business transaction. They began to advance, their pace a slow, deliberate walk, the rhythmic clop of 30 horses on hard-packed earth, the sound of a ticking clock. "Hold your fire," Jed whispered from his position by the opposite window. "Let 'em get close. Make every shot count." The riders advanced until they were 50 yards away, then dismounted in perfect unison. Thorne drew his pistol, the motion fluid and economical. "The building," he commanded, his voice carrying with chilling clarity. "Level it." The world erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire. The front of the clinic was torn apart by a relentless volley of lead. Wood splintered, glass exploded, and bullets thudded into the thick sod walls. The defenders hunkered down, waiting out the initial storm. "Now," Ellie yelled. 10 guns answered from the clinic. The first volley was a ragged but ferocious roar of defiance. A man in the front rank of Croft's force crumpled to the ground. Another spun around, clutching his arm. The professional assault faltered for a half-second, stunned by the ferocity of the resistance. That was all the opening the defenders needed. They fired again, the blacksmith's heavy-caliber buffalo gun punching a hole through the line. The fight for the clinic was claustrophobic and brutal. Thorne's men advanced, using barrels and horse troughs for cover, their fire systematic and overwhelming. Inside, Ellie was a whirlwind of motion. She fired her shotgun, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, then dropped it to press a bandage onto a miner's bleeding arm. "Silas, cover that window!" she ordered, her voice cutting through the din. She shoved a fresh shell into the shotgun, just as one of Thorne's men made a dash for the porch. Jed's Colt barked twice, and the man fell backward. For 20 minutes the small clinic held, but they were taking a beating. The front wall was turning into Swiss cheese. The defenders were running low on ammunition. Thorne, his face an impassive mask, saw his advantage. He motioned to 2 of his men, who broke from cover, carrying heavy canvas sacks. "Dynamite! They're bringing the devil to our doorstep!" Jed yelled. "Get ready to move! Back door! Go!" This was the moment they had planned for. As Thorne's men lit the fuses and hurled the charges at the clinic, the defenders were already scrambling out the back, disappearing into the alleyway. The dynamite exploded with a titanic blast, blowing the front wall of the clinic inward and sending a plume of fire and splinters into the sky. Thorne's men let out a triumphant yell, assuming the fight was over. They advanced on the ruined structure, rifles at the ready. "Flush them out," Thorne commanded. As they converged on the clinic, moving past the feed store and the assayer's office, Silas the miner, hidden on a rooftop down the street, touched a lit cigar to a fuse. The ground itself seemed to heave. With 2 deafening, concussive roars, the rigged buildings on either side of the street erupted. The explosions were not designed to be precise weapons, but instruments of pure chaos. Windows shattered up and down the street, a shockwave of dust and debris blasted through the advancing men, and the facades of the buildings crumbled, creating a narrow, impassable canyon of rubble and smoke. Thorne's force, which had been a disciplined line, was now a panicked, disorganized mob trapped in the very kill zone the defenders had designed. And from the windows and rooftops on the other side of the choke point, the defenders opened fire. The sight of Thorne's army being thrown into chaos by a handful of miners had a profound effect on the rest of the town. A second-story shutter on the Gilded Cage saloon creaked open. O'Malley, the bartender, leveled an old shotgun and fired both barrels into the confused mass of Croft's men. From the general store, another rifle shot rang out. The fear that had paralyzed Redemption Gulch had finally been broken by the thunder of dynamite and the raw courage of its few defiant citizens. Then came the moment of catharsis. The door to the sheriff's office flew open, and Sheriff Brody stepped out, a shotgun in one hand and his Colt in the other. He was no longer the broken, whispering coward. His eyes were clear and hard. "This is an illegal assembly," he bellowed, his voice raw with newfound authority. "Lay down your arms by order of the law." He then opened fire, joining the uprising. It was a full-blown revolution. Captain Thorne, a professional to the last, fought to regain control, but his men were pinned down and being picked apart. He spotted Jed reloading on a balcony and saw his chance to eliminate a key piece of the resistance. He broke from cover, his pistol raised. Jed saw him coming. The world seemed to slow down as the 2 men faced each other across the dusty, corpse-strewn street. It was the old lawman and the new enforcer. They fired at the same instant. Thorne was thrown backward, a dark hole appearing in his chest. Jed stood for a moment, a look of surprise on his face, before he slowly sank to his knees, clutching a spreading red stain on his own gut. He had died a lawman after all. Watching the battle crumble from the window of his opulent train car, Silas Croft was consumed by a black, impotent rage. His army was broken, his authority shattered. This was not a business transaction. It was a personal humiliation. His cold control snapped. With a guttural roar, he grabbed a rifle from his private rack and stormed out of the car, his face contorted in a mask of fury. He stalked through the chaos, heedless of the stray bullets, his eyes fixed on one target, the ruined clinic where it had all begun. Ellie was inside, trying to save a miner who had taken a ricochet to the lung when Croft burst through the shattered doorway. He was a wild man, his perfect suit covered in dust, his silver hair askew. He leveled the rifle at her. "You," he snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. "You ruined everything." Ellie had no ammunition left. Her shotgun was empty. She stood up slowly, her hands empty, and faced him without fear. "You did this to yourself, Silas." He laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. "I am this town!" he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before he could fire, dark shapes filled the ruined doorway behind him. Thomas Gable, leaning on the blacksmith, stood there, a pistol in his hand. Behind him were the other miners, their faces hard as granite, their eyes burning with a righteous fury that 1,000 private armies could not quell. They were covered in soot and blood, no longer broken tools, but men who had reclaimed their souls. Croft spun around, his rifle swinging toward them. He was surrounded. He looked from one determined face to the next, and for the first time, the vulture of Redemption Gulch looked afraid. His power had always been absolute, because the fear he inspired was absolute. But in this room, at this moment, no one was afraid of him anymore. The blacksmith stepped forward, and with one massive hand, simply took the rifle from Croft's grasp, snapping it over his knee as if it were a twig. Silas Croft stood there, disarmed and defeated, not by a bullet, but by the defiant gaze of the very people he had deemed worthless. The silence that fell over the street was more profound than the gunfire had been loud. It was a heavy, ringing quiet, filled with the groans of the wounded and the sight of smoke curling lazily from smoldering ruins. The battle, which had felt like an eternity, had lasted less than an hour. The people of Redemption Gulch emerged slowly from their homes and hiding places, their faces a mixture of shock, grief, and a dawning, disbelieving sense of freedom. The street was a wreck, littered with the bodies of the dead and the writhing forms of the wounded from both sides. For a moment, Ellie simply stood in the ruined doorway of her clinic, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. Silas Croft, a shrunken, pathetic figure, was hauled away by the blacksmith and another miner, his furious, empty threats ignored by all. Then Ellie's training, her very nature, took over. The battle was over, but her work was not. She turned to the stunned townspeople who were gathering around. "Don't just stand there," she commanded, her voice cutting through their daze. Once again the doctor, not the general. "Sarah, bring me every clean sheet and bandage you can find. Mr. Henderson, I need water, barrels of it. We have lives to save." A miner spat on the ground, gesturing with his rifle toward one of Croft's wounded men. "Let 'em bleed out. They ain't worth the trouble." Ellie walked over to him and looked him square in the eye, her own face smudged with soot and blood. "We did not fight to become them," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "We fought so we wouldn't have to be. Now you will help me save this man, or you will get out of my way." The miner held her gaze for a long moment, then looked down in shame and nodded, laying down his rifle. A new law had been established in Redemption Gulch, one based not on power, but on principle. Under Ellie's direction, the street was transformed once more into a triage center. This time, there was no distinction made between friend and foe. A life was a life, and they saved who they could. Sheriff Brody, his face set with a grim resolve he hadn't worn in years, walked up to Silas Croft. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled out a pair of iron handcuffs and locked them around the magnate's wrists. The sharp click-clack of the cuffs was the sound of a new era beginning, the restoration of law over the tyranny of wealth. Croft looked at the badge on Brody's chest with utter contempt, but for the first time, his gaze held no power. He was just a prisoner. The victory was not without its terrible price. Ellie found Jed on the balcony where he had fallen. He was still conscious, barely. She knelt beside him, trying to stop the bleeding, but they both knew it was a losing battle. He looked up at her, a faint, wry smile on his lips. "Looks like. You were right, Doc," he wheezed. "Sometimes, they don't fold." "Rest now, Jedediah," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." He coughed, a pained grimace flashing across his face. "Nah," he said, his eyes starting to glaze over. "Just paid an old debt." His eyes closed, and the cynical old prospector who had died a hero was gone. Ellie gently closed his eyes and stood up, looking out over the town he had helped to save. The dust was settling, and in the quiet aftermath, the true cost of their freedom was finally becoming clear. The first snows of winter had begun to dust the high peaks surrounding the valley, a clean, white blanket covering the scars of the past. 2 months had passed since the battle. The physical rebuilding of Redemption Gulch was nearly complete, the sounds of hammers and saws having long replaced the echo of gunfire. But the real change was in the air itself. The oppressive weight of fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and a boisterous, resilient spirit. Silas Croft and the surviving members of his private army had been sent by train to the territorial capital to face federal justice, his vast holdings tied up in legal challenges. In his absence, the miners had done the unthinkable. They had formed a cooperative, taking over the operation of the Croft Consolidated Mine themselves. For the first time, the men who descended into the darkness each day did so for their own families, not for the enrichment of a distant tyrant. The town was healing, not just its buildings, but its very soul. Ellie's clinic was fully repaired, its new front wall built from sturdy, fresh-cut pine. It smelled of sawdust and carbolic acid, a scent she now found comforting. Beside the door, the blacksmith had mounted a simple, hand-forged bronze plaque. It didn't list every name, but simply read, "For those who remembered how to stand." She was still the town doctor, but now she was something more. She was the heart of the town council, her quiet, steady voice, a guiding force in every major decision. She was consulted on matters of law, commerce, and community. She had earned her place not through force or finance, but through a courage that had reminded everyone else of their own. One crisp afternoon, she stood on her porch, the same porch that had once been a battlefield, and watched the life of her town unfold. A group of children, their laughter echoing in the clean mountain air, chased a stray dog down the main street. Thomas Gable, now fully recovered and elected foreman of the new mining co-op, sat on a bench outside the general store, patiently teaching his young daughter how to read from an old primer. The new sheriff, a former miner with kind eyes and a steady hand, tipped his hat to her as he passed on his daily patrol. The town of Redemption Gulch had finally lived up to its name. Ellie looked out at the distant, snow-capped mountains, the same ones that had once seemed like the walls of a prison. Now, they looked like a promise. She hadn't run. She had stayed, and in doing so, had helped a broken town find its courage and heal itself. A faint, satisfied smile touched her lips. She had found her home.